I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everybody for joining the Gender-Based Violence Consortium's Teaching Gender-Based Violence discussion. This is our community gathering that we've been doing on a bi-monthly basis since March. And so welcome everyone for joining. Please note that this conversation is being recorded. And so I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And I'm just going to go over a few things really briefly, and then we're going to hear from some amazing folks. So I'm just gonna, there we go. All right, so just as a friendly reminder, these are some of our leadership folks. We have some here on the call. Thank you for joining us. We've got Sonia Salari, Yoshimi Anzai, Leslie Halpern, and then we also have Heather Melton, Karen Frost. So thank you all for joining, and maybe our other colleagues might join us later. But just know that this conversation will be available. We are in the process to create a YouTube channel that will include some of our prior conversations and video clips from them before as well. Just as a friendly reminder, the GBVC's commitments are to bringing together an interdisciplinary team of scholars representing multiple colleges across the campus at the University of Utah, but it's also to facilitate an interprofessional collaboration. And so we've got folks who are joining from all over the state, and we thank you for continuing to participate in the Gender-Based Violence Consortium. Just as a friendly reminder, when we talk about gender-based violence, it is understood as a violence that results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering based on a person's gender where coercion or arbitrary deprivations of freedom occurs in public or private life. We recognize that gender is complex and a multi-level cultural construct structured by intersecting identities. We do have some community partners. This is not a comprehensive list. We have folks who we've also been informally partnering with. Our website is under development, but just a little bit about some of our partners. It includes WIMS, Nexus, Digital Matters, UDVC, the YWCA, FJC, and South Valley Services. Just as a friendly reminder, save the date for some of these events that are coming up. There is the WIMS event, which is Fighting Against Gender-Based Violence webinar. You'll receive a link of how to join. That event will be October 7th at 4 p.m. We also want to also put on your calendars what's going to happen on October 15th at 3 p.m. Reclaiming Our Values and Visibility in Indian Country, Native Americans Addressing Intimate Partner Violence. That will be part of a multi-series events in collaboration with Law School. And also we are hoping other partners as well, including the American Indian Resource Center. And then there's also a webinar on gender, addiction, and violence, victims in healthcare that will be happening on October 22nd at 6 p.m., primarily targeted at people earlier in their careers in the medical school. And so those are just some of the events to put on your calendars. And stay tuned, as you all may be aware, for Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Those are just some of the events that are happening. There's going to be a ton of events that we will be sharing with you all, as well as that we will be creating toolkit. And so we're going to be sharing that with the listserv for folks to share. So we'll be creating a toolkit. As well as we want to encourage folks to follow Utah Domestic Violence Coalition and Fight Against Domestic Violence, which will be also disseminating through their websites and social media platforms information about local events in Utah. So that's just a little bit about some of the things that we have going on, but you're all here really to hear about teaching gender-based violence. And so let's get to this exciting content. We are going to be hearing from three colleagues. We'll be hearing from Dr. Sonia Salari, Dr. Heather Melton, as well as Dr. Elizabeth Bond-Rogers. I'm going to first present them, and then they will do a brief presentation. I'll present the next person, and then they'll do a brief presentation, and then the final person. And then we'll open it up for a dialogue. But first, without further ado, let me introduce you to my colleague, collaborator, co-conspirator, Dr. Sonia Salari, who is a professor of family and consumer studies. She is a sociologist with a specialty in gerontology, aging services, family violence, diversity, and public policy. She is known as an advocate for victims. Her research on elder abuse and lethal domestic violence led her to study intimate partner murder, suicides across age groups. Her work is published in multiple journals, and she has a book that you should really check out. I myself have used it and cited it as well. It's called Family Violence Across the Life Course, Research, Policy, and Prevention. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sonia Salari.
I came across this little slide that begins, it sort of reminds me of a gender reveal party, or perhaps even some fabric softener going into the laundry. I'm not sure, but anyway, we are all a little bit sensitive to the idea of the gender reveal party right now, since it did cause such a large fire in, wasn't it California? So people have been really going, you know, hard into this idea of focusing on the gender of their new baby. And so I have my students think about this newborn baby experiment where they consider how they would feel if their friend had a baby and sent out announcements, and it turns out that they didn't mention whether it was a boy or a girl. And some of the students get rather fired up about the idea of not knowing. So what does it mean to be male, female, non-binary, and how is it related to interpersonal violence? So we definitely have patterns that we can see with regard to intimate partner violence, intimate partner homicide, child abuse, even trafficking, LGBTQ plus violence, campus violence, military violence, even violence among police families. And I do a lot of study of fatal family violence and elder abuse. So those are also things that we're going to look at. So in terms of pedagogy, or I like to use the word andragogy because it has to do with teaching adults. And so it's important to recognize the adult status of the audience at a university. And pedagogy actually means leading children. So this is the preferred term for me. And adult-centered learning relies on a rationale for why is it we are learning this. It also relies on self-direction and opportunities for leadership, also active learning, and using the life experience of the student. And also, my little ad here is to avoid infantilization of the students in the university setting. So I've heard it as we were coming back to, you know, start up school again in the fall, and the question about the pandemic, should we, you know, have the universities open and so forth. But there were people on CNN saying, you know, well, the kids who are going to college, and they just kept using this kids term when really they should be thinking of them as adults and not as kids. So, so anyway, I've been teaching FCS 5370 family violence. It's been more than 2 decades now, and there's difficult content. I have had 2 people lose consciousness in the class, and so we had to get them medical care. So I do, you know, encourage people to self-regulate if they have to leave the room, if they have to just miss a class. I'm not there to discipline them. So it is about self-care and self-regulation and realizing what they can or can't, you know, put up with that day. And so I usually just leave a number of options or warnings ahead of some of the things that might be difficult to hear. I do teach most of these years I've taught in person. With the pandemic, I started teaching fully online, but prior to that, I had done some summers that were hybrid classes. And this is a communication and writing class as well. So there's a lot of writing associated with it, and the hybrid summer course works well. And then I did teach an honors praxis lab that was also called Family Violence. So that was interesting, year-long course in person. So we need to recognize certain truths, like gender-based violence cannot be fully known. So we have that iceberg, and I know you've seen my iceberg before with the, you know, the amount, and healthcare uses this too, where you have the amount that's above the water that you can see, but there's so much below the water that is not really measurable. That's one reason why I study homicides and fatal family violence, which is more measurable. Okay, so then we have across the life course. I want to hear, you know, about later life, persons of any age with disabilities, race, ethnicities, multiracial identities, immigration status, international. Don't even get me started about, you know, the US versus the other developed countries. But we also look at developing countries. And so that gives people a good sense of gender oppression as well. And so institutions, the military, campuses, those sorts of things, policies, prevention strategies, and recognizing distinctions. I'll be talking about that at more length in terms of like who is the offender. I use a lot of vision and sound. You may have noticed that. And stalker songs, 911 calls, movie clips, things like that. Case studies, which is where I bring in some old stories from, you know, my years as a victim advocate. And also the research is something that I bring forward. And this is from one of my articles that was just published this year. And it shows 34 years of homicides. This first graphic is male homicides, and it's by age. Age of the victim is the x-axis, and age of the offender is the y-axis. And so you can see a lot of points are in the center there. So this is then the female homicide victims, and it's a completely different type of statistical ellipse that shows what the types of homicide perpetrator relationships are there. So for men, it's acquaintances and strangers. For women, it's intimate partners and other family. So male homicide victims have 7% killed by an intimate partner, whereas women, it's 55 to 63% killed by an intimate partner. So that alone helps to describe why we call it gender-based violence. I use examples of, you know, famous intimate partner violence cases that people may have seen or heard about, including those that have male victims. I'm still not over the Phil Hartman thing. Definitely a huge tragedy with their children included, you know, at the home. I mean, the children are surviving, but they were there at the time of the murder-suicide. That's what IPHS means. And then also Jodi Arias, definitely I would call her an intimate terrorist, and we're going to be talking about intimate terrorism in a second, because she really used quite a lot of violence against her ex-boyfriend. So then also LGBTQ plus examples, the Hart family, people know about that from the lesbian couple that had adopted a number of children, and then ultimately there were allegations of child abuse and they drove their van off a cliff in California. And then we have also cases right here in town, such as John Williams from gastronomy fame, who was killed by his husband. And so I do feel like distinctions are super important. Back when I was a victim advocate, we thought that all intimate partner homicide was the same, or intimate partner violence, I mean, was the same. So Michael Johnson really brought, you know, a lot to the, I felt to the dialogue, and indicated that intimate terrorists, or IT as I call them, are, you know, of particular danger to the victim. Now, he used it to talk about heterosexual couples, but it could be true for LGBTQ plus, any kind of same-sex couple. And so basically there's poly-victimization used, and that's really the power and control wheel. If you remember that old-fashioned power and control wheel, talked about financial abuse and use of the children and isolation and all that. That is definitely applying to the intimate terrorist. Bad empathy is, you know, where the perpetrator zeroes in on the weakness of the individual and uses that against them. So whatever they're hardest about for themselves is what will be used by the intimate terrorist. And cycle of violence. I think it looks like a tornado, and I would argue that this again is probably intimate terrorist type pattern. And so victims may return a number of times to an intimate terrorist because of the power and control dynamic that holds things above their heads. And also perpetrators are manipulative of the court system. So we need things like lethality assessment protocols. And, you know, we need to really focus on an enforcement strategy that helps the courts to recognize these types of intimate terrorists. And this is a little clip about somebody actually who's in the advocacy field in Salt Lake City. So it's just a little clip I use to introduce the intimate terrorist.
The physical abuse started with a slap in the face, and it slowly escalated into more physical violence, and abuse, choking. I tried to be perfect, but yet it didn't matter. You know, it's still, he would get upset if I forgot to bring milk home from the store, and that would cause him to be physically violent with me. And then afterwards, he'd be really sorry, and I believed him. After 6 years of marriage, Brandy decided she couldn't put up with the abuse anymore. She asked for a divorce. He said to me, "No, you're not going to get a divorce." And I said, "Yes, I want one. You know, I can't stay here anymore. I can't take it anymore." And so he walked away from me, and he walked into his office. And I followed him because he didn't usually give up that easily. And he had a gun in his hand, and he was loading it. And he walked into our daughter's bedroom. And I was shocked when I walked in there, and Angela was, you know, she was standing in her crib, and she was just bouncing up and down, and he had put a gun to one of her ears, and then the other hand was over the other ear, and he said, "Now, tell me that you leave me, and I'll blow her brains out, and then I'll blow your brains out, and then I'll blow my brains out." And the only thought that came to my mind was my son coming home from school, and I thought, this would affect him for the rest of his life. And I fell at my husband's feet, and I said, "Please don't kill my baby. I'll do anything you say, but just please don't kill my baby." And that's when I decided that I needed to reach out, to talk to someone, to tell someone, you know, what was happening in our lives, because up until that point, it was just a secret. My son, I know, was really affected. by it because a lot of times he would try to help me, and he would get beat in the process. He was really angry with me, and I was actually saving his life by staying there because my husband was telling me that if I left, that he would find me and he would kill me and he would kill the children too. You know, I walked around every day, and I knew that, you know, that might be the day that I would die. I felt like I was a walking dead woman. And so I thought, I have to leave. And if I had to die leaving, I would rather have the courage, you know, to leave and at least get out instead of staying and dying. How can we?
Okay, so she has gone on to be a superstar in the local community with regard to victim advocacy. And I've even had her come in and give a guest lecture one year. I just happened to meet up with her in a meeting. It was kind of funny because I was showing her video for umpteen million years, and then there she was. So finally, you know, that's getting, I think you can see and unpack that video with so many things going on in terms of that intimate terrorism and what he had been holding over her head and that sort of thing, but then finally finding the courage to try to get some help. So the common couple aggression is different because really it's about minor violence. Maybe it's about people who are, you know, they're bad at having a fight. Their quarrels turn physical, but they're not meant to harm the self-image of that person or the identity of the person. They're just kind of out of control. And so I think in these cases, you could say maybe no prison is needed, and community-based options might be a better way to go there. And in fact, you don't want this kind of person to show up in prison and, you know, then, you know, let the IT person roam the streets, right? So there's also the violent resistance, which is that person who's been terrorized for years and then finally decides they're going to get help. And there sometimes tends to be a little bit of self-defense violence that might take place there. And so it would help for police to know maybe not to arrest that person and to be able to recognize if there's been a long-term pattern, like the primary aggressor analyses that police do. So it's really a human rights issue. There are a number of things here. We don't feel like any interpersonal violence is inconsequential. And so it's important to know that women are more likely injured or killed by intimate partner violence. And that's, you know, part of why we focus on that. But certainly the policies are expected to have people who are, you know, female, male, non-binary be able to benefit from the services provided. And also to realize that survivor autonomy is important. So we don't want to assume that they have to break up in order to get any kind of services, because it used to be like, well, are you still with them? Okay, well, forget it. And we don't want to infantilize survivors either. You know, we want to give them the opportunity to make the decisions for themselves. So here's my last slide with the idea of a focus on healthy relationships, primary prevention, and the equality wheel. Okay,
thank you so much. That was wonderful, Sonia. We're going to go on and now go and move towards Heather, who is Dr. Heather Melton, who is our next speaker. Dr. Heather Melton is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Utah. Her research focuses on violence against women, intimate partner violence, stalking, and sexual assault, and the criminal justice response to these problems. Specifically, she's published on topics such as predicting stalking in the context of IPA, the criminal justice response to stalking, gender differences in the perpetration of IPA, police response to IPA, and the impact of myths. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melton.
But thank you for letting me talk about this. This is something that's certainly been very important in my work, both in terms of research and teaching. So I'm always happy to talk about it. So I am a sociologist. However, I'm a trained criminologist. So I teach a lot of classes related to our criminology degree, our criminology major, as well as their classes that are applicable to sociology. And I teach, I teach a variety of classes from kind of the criminology, which is really the introductory class, to courses that are specific to gender-based violence. And those two last courses, Women in Crime and Sexual Assault, are two courses that I created since I came to the university, in large part because I always try to get these issues in every class I teach, and I realized I just was not getting enough. So for example, in my Women in Crime class, I have a whole section on gender-based violence, and I talk about sexual assault, and I give it 2 weeks, and I inevitably go to 3, sometimes 4 weeks on it. So I said, okay, I need to create a class, which now I'm like, I need to create a 2-part class so I could have 2 semesters of it. And I do it in a variety of online and in class. I've done both, which both present challenges in how to teach these things. So I think those are things that people need to think about if they're doing something online versus in class, because again, they both have pros, but they both can be challenging as well. And so what I thought I'd just do is highlight what's important to me in my classes, not necessarily specific things I talk about in these classes. And I think the biggest thing for me, what I hope my students get out of it, is just an understanding of how important these issues of gender-based violence are. I think a lot of people come into these courses, particularly just my general crim course, which is a required course for all criminology majors, just thinking, oh, well, yeah, that's something that they deal with. I've never experienced it. It doesn't affect my life. Yeah, it's important. We should, look at it, but it's not affecting me. And so I really try to stress, yes, it is, regardless of if you've experienced it individually, it's impacting you, it's impacting your relationships. I guarantee you there are people around you who've experienced it. It's impacting, I one time had my father, who's a businessman, came to one of my presentations, and he said, my God, if businesses just realized how this is affecting productivity, regardless of anything else, there are certainly other reasons they should see it as important, but if they just realized that, they'd be throwing money into this to try and figure out how to solve the issue of gender-based violence. So I really hope that that's what students come out of the class realizing, and I think I've been pretty successful at doing that. I talk about it in every class I teach. I have found, ways to talk about it in classes that it doesn't seem like it fits, but I make sure I talk about it. And I think that's in part kind of how I get across that import. And obviously it'll be different. So, I always make sure in my criminology class, when we talk about theory, that I pull it into the discussion on theory. I always talk about it at the end of course when I'm talking about kind of intervention and prevention. So it's there in every class. Obviously, in my Women in Crime class, my Women in Crime class covers female offenders, gender-based violence, and then females working in the criminal justice system. And one of the things I do in that class is I talk about it in all 3 of those sections, because I think it applies to all 3. We know that there's a relationship between experiencing or witnessing violence as a child and becoming an offender. And once you're an offender, we know you're at higher risk for victimization. So I, make sure I talk about that cycle. We know that people who enter the field very often enter this field because of their experiences. So I really try to get that across in that class. I think it's really important to address the many stereotypes and misconceptions about GBV. I think Sonia did a great job talking about kind of different offenders, different victims that I think oftentimes people don't think about. And that's certainly changed, I'd say, even in the time I've been teaching. But a lot of people come in with, you know, what they've seen on TV and think that that's what this is. And so I think it's important to really dive in and address those things. Being inclusive of different experiences, I think is again something that is so important, that there's no typical experience with issues of intimate partner abuse or sexual assault. And so making sure that you're inclusive of all the different experiences. What are the commonalities, but then what are the unique factors that we need to think about? Something that might impact how something that's very important to me is how survivors interact with the criminal justice system. So how their unique experience might then impact that interaction, and how that maybe needs to change how we respond. And then lastly, I think it's so important to address what we should do about it. And I try to do this again in all my classes, certainly in criminology, not just about this issue, but about just crime in general. That to me, it's so important that we not just, okay, I can show you all the research, I can show you all these factors about it, but what do we do with that? You know, when we're talking about theory, what does that mean? If we can understand why somebody's doing something, then how does that translate into a way to intervene or respond or prevent it? And when we have a program that doesn't work, you know, have we really explored that about why somebody's doing it? Because if we don't address why people are doing what they're doing, we're never going to have any impact either in intervention or prevention. So I always try to do that. Challenges, I think, certainly students encountering and challenging these preconceived or misconceptions or stereotypes about gender-based violence is definitely challenging. And it's been interesting because, you know, one, I think very often students do it. I don't even have to do it, which is great. That somebody will say something very victim blaming or you know, why do they stay or something like that, and students will intervene and talk about why that's problematic. And so I think it's a challenge, certainly, but then it's also you know, a teaching moment. But I also, you know, it's challenging to not, because I don't want to just shut somebody down so that they don't listen to anything else I say. So how do you do it in such a way that you know, kind of acknowledges what they're saying, but then you know, discusses the problematic nature maybe of what they're saying. So certainly dealing with a lot of victim blaming attitudes is definitely a challenge. But again, hopefully that's something I hope they take out of the class, is what that was, and you know, maybe why they shouldn't be doing that. Being inclusive of diversity, I think, is very challenging. And you know, I had a student once who was one of my favorite students, and she came up to me. She had taken all my classes, and she came up to me at the end when she was about to graduate. And, you know, she said, you know, I really appreciate, she was LGBTQ. She said, I really appreciate you always raising issues related to LGBTQ, but sometimes you made me feel like a bullet point. And this was, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And it just, I think of that every time I try to talk about this. How to do this in such a way that does not do that. And I think that can be very challenging, because you do need to talk about an overall experience, but how can you make sure that diversity is included in that? And then I think dealing with their experiences, you know, as you know, people disclose, people talk about it. One of the things I do in my class that I think is important is I disclose my experience. And I didn't set out to do this in my career, but when I first started teaching, I remember I was teaching criminology. I had a section on sexual assault. You know, my dissertation was on this. I did multiple presentations on this, but there was something about standing in front of 100 students talking about it. I just started crying. And so they're wondering, you know, what the hell's going on, you know? And so I started talking about my experience. You know, at that point I was totally recovered, but I just didn't realize what talking about it like that would make me feel. So now I do that, you know, in part because my experience it illustrates some of the things I want to say. And I want them also to know that they know somebody who's experienced it. But that certainly then brings a lot of people talking about it, which I think is great. I think it's great for people who haven't experienced it to hear those, but it can be challenging because it can be traumatic. It can have people dealing with things come up that obviously you know, things have changed in what we have to do. but trying to get them to resources and that sort of thing. So I certainly think it's very important. It's important to me in how I teach, but it can be, certainly can be challenging and hard. I have two quick activities, and first, I just, again, related to that, the solutions, I always have a research paper where they have to do that, because again, that's one thing I really want them to take out. So if you talk about the issue, but then what should we be doing about that? And then I do an activity, and I do this for several reasons, and I wish, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I wish I had, gotten IRB approval and I could do something with all this information I have, but I assign students, and this is my criminology class, to look at campus resources on gender-based violence. And so they've been doing this. I have them do it every semester, and it's fascinating how it's changed, what they find, the differences in a semester, which again, I think illustrate some of the problems, because they find very different things. And have them talk about, if you were a victim, if you had just experienced this, how would you interact with this resource? How would this resonate with you? So I do it for that reason, as well as just, I want them to know the resources out there. So I do it so that they have that, leave class with that knowledge. So again, I one of the things I try to get across is how passionate about this topic I am and how important I think it is. And that is what my presentation. So thank you.
All right. Okay, so thank you so much for that. And actually, I think some of the themes you were bringing up actually nicely segues to Dr. Elizabeth Vaughn Rogers, who's an associate instructor with the University of Utah Center for Teaching and Learning Excellence and the Office for Inclusive Excellence. And she facilitates this amazing faculty learning community that I've been participating in. If you are interested in participating in this learning community, I really encourage you to reach out to her. And I spelled her name wrong, I just noticed, so apologies for that. I am surrounded by typos and making them myself, so apologies. But please do reach out to her if you're interested in joining this learning community. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague.
Lovely, thank you, Dr. Fukushima, and thanks to Drs. Salari and Melton. That was really great, and I appreciate learning about the things that you were teaching. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about, well, I'll dive in, I'll share screen. And I think we have until 5:30. So I'm going to try and go a little more quickly than I normally would, so that we can really make sure we have some time for questions and for dialogue. So I'd like to talk a little bit about inclusive teaching. That's something that I focus on quite a bit with faculty at the university. And I'm just going to focus particularly on our current context that we're living in. I'd like to talk a little bit about trauma-informed pedagogy, and this is something that I've been learning a lot more about. I'm sure many of you are in this particular group, of course, are very familiar with this work, and it's been something that I've been trying to learn more about and have been interested in, especially in how much crossover there is between trauma-informed pedagogy and inclusive pedagogy. I'm also interested in hearing a little bit about your thoughts on content or trigger warnings. And so I have a few thoughts on that, and then just some campus resources that are available at the university that I want to make sure that you have as faculty, and then also that you can provide for your students. So in thinking about the context, as we talk about inclusive teaching and classroom climate, gosh, the things that have been coming up that all of you are dealing with as faculty, teaching remotely, teaching online, and everything that our students are experiencing, but it's in this context of the pandemic and social isolation. We've got a virus, we have racial violence and protests, and then on top of it, an increasingly heated and polarized political climate that is just causing an enormous amount of distress and tension. I wanted to include our beautiful RBG, and her passing, acknowledge her incredible work around social justice. So I had to include her in this because of how much that is contributing to the social and political climate right now, and lots of folks are thinking about these things. The other piece is, of course, and this is really related to trauma, And not just the experiences of our students, but of course how we're experiencing it. And I know we come into education because we love teaching and we love our students and we put all of our energy to them, often to the expense of our own well-being. So, as we think about our students and ourselves, we are observing in this context of teaching different levels of access, whether that is internet, whether that's technology, whether that's access to appropriate health care, different mental health care. There's a lot of different levels there that folks need and may not have. Different levels of responsibility. Some of our students and some of you are parents and have kids. Some of your students have full-time jobs and are essential healthcare workers trying to balance. So there's so many different, or maybe they're caring for a family member, different levels of responsibility, different levels of resilience in the face of these particular challenges in the pandemic and different forms of trauma, different levels of stress, grief and mourning, and different levels of equity. In terms of how they're experiencing teaching and learning in their classrooms, as well as their lives. So just acknowledging some of those pieces as we talk about context. So I wanted to just speak briefly to inclusive teaching encompasses so many things. For those of you that have had the opportunity to look into inclusive teaching strategies, and there's a lot of research around it about how certain strategies really do support all students. Sometimes it can get misinterpreted that, you're teaching, using different strategies to teach different student populations. And in reality, it's just using really particularly great teaching strategies, really, that support the learning of all students. So in terms of right now and in online teaching, I came up with a handful of thoughts just as you're thinking about what you're focusing on in your coursework. But the first one and the biggest one, I think, is communication. So we have, in this context, students where questions that are coming up with how do we keep our students engaged? And one of the biggest questions is, if you're doing Zoom teaching where your students are synchronous or your courses are synchronous, the whole question of video being on or off is this big debate. And we can, if there's questions about that, there's certainly no perfect answer there, but there's some good answers related to trauma and inclusivity. But communication, particularly around transparency, not even your own transparency as a person and what you're going through. And that's just your comfort level in terms of your comfort of how vulnerable you choose to be with your students. Some folks don't want to go there and some do. So that part of it is personal, but it's also your assignments and why, being really clear. Transparency in teaching is also something you may be familiar with, but it's really based around being extremely clear with your students about, why they're doing an assignment, what are the learning outcomes, how are they being assessed, perhaps, including some examples of good work, exceptional work, and maybe not such good work, so they can have a gauge of your evaluation processes. Providing regular feedback to students is really helpful, and doing regular check-ins. So that's a big part of online teaching is if you just have, two big assignments, that maybe works really well in face-to-face classes, you can lose students because they're not getting that regular accountability factor where they're seeing you, hearing from you, interacting with their peers. So thinking about ways to incorporate that maybe more than you would in a face-to-face course. For connection, and this is, I believe that Dr. Salari mentioned this, or it may be just in my mind, but connection to their lived experiences and what's going on with how can you connect your course, not literally to the pandemic per se, but to the experience that they're having during the pandemic, during the political climate and the protests. So connecting how they're doing and living through this experience with your coursework and even in just small capacities can be really helpful. Thinking about developing even more intentionally community online with the students, whether that's through collaborative work, really promoting that sense of belonging. So that's something that I noticed with trauma pedagogy. There's a lot of talk about safety. In inclusive teaching, there's a lot of talk about sense of belonging. And so, which of course are similar, but there's, a lot of questioning around this idea of safety in the classroom and that pushback of, is that even possible? Could we ever guarantee safety? And so there's A lot of it is also just language and the words that we choose to use in our attempt to create community for students and help them feel safe and a sense of belonging. Student forums, online question forums have been really helpful to keep students engaged, allowing them to ask questions of each other. And in some cases, maybe you tell the students that you aren't even part of that. You know, maybe you'll check in once a week and it's really meant for them to ask each other questions and communicate. And then lastly, consistency, thinking about students having, say, 5 online classes where they're trying to navigate, you know, all the different, you know, the different faculty, all these assignments. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work for faculty as well. But thinking about having really consistent assignment dates and deadlines, having some extra reminders. So those of you that are familiar with trauma pedagogy, you know, when students are experiencing trauma or maybe have an experience in the course where there is some kind of trigger or content situation where they're triggered. I don't love the word triggered. I'd like to find some other word because I feel like that's a challenging word for me, but we can work on that. Maybe y'all have a suggestion. I keep saying content warning, but I don't know if that's the right one either, but continual reminders. So thinking about, say, on Monday morning, and this is just an example, but I know of a faculty that every Monday morning they send out an announcement that talks about the week and reminds students of deadlines that are coming up. And then on Friday, they send out an announcement that's just a personal check-in. How's everyone doing? Just checking in. Have a good weekend. If you have any questions, post them here, or, you know, just a more kind of community, you know, personal interaction. So that's something to consider. So trauma-informed pedagogy, taking this definition from online, it's a commonly used one, but an event, series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual is physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And of course, the challenge, as Dr. Melton said, is the diversity of experiences that people have in response to trauma. That, of course, 2 siblings can experience the exact same trauma and experience it in their life completely differently. And so we can't ever, of course, anticipate triggers. We can't ever, you know, anticipate exactly how someone would experience trauma, but knowing that there will be some kind of response. So in terms of trauma-informed pedagogy, I've learned a lot from Dr. Maisie Maud. She actually presented, maybe some of you were there, there was a conference on Saturday, just this past Saturday morning, Utah statewide, that UVU put on, and she was the keynote speaker and did a wonderful presentation on trauma-informed pedagogy. But she has several questions thinking through how does this pandemic and how does the trauma that this causes, how does this affect students' ability to learn? She calls it the lonely, the anxious, and the fearful. How do we teach to students that are in these very traumatic states or at very high levels of stress, and how can we mitigate those experiences for our students as we're teaching and thinking through some of those strategies? And I named just a handful, but there are, of course, many more. Dr. Imad writes, if we want our students to learn, we must recognize trauma in ourselves and our students, and at the very least, ensure that we help our students feel safe, empowered, and connected. And I think a lot of that is just that the humanness of you as the faculty, you know, reaching out, how are you, just doing maybe more regular connections in that way than maybe that you would in face-to-face, because in face-to-face, they feel your presence, you know, maybe more so. But, you know, as she writes, what does this mean for students' ability to learn? I also ask, you know, what does this mean for faculty's ability to teach? You know, there's a lot of faculty that are part of the lonely, anxious, and fearful and experiencing significant trauma. And so it's really recognizing that amongst ourselves as faculty as well. And so I'm putting those as questions to put forth that we can perhaps talk through. A few more things about trauma-informed pedagogy. When the brain is under traumatic stress, it goes into survival mode by prioritizing what matters, conserving energy to stay alive. Learning, which requires the expenditure of energy, becomes physiologically less of a priority to our brain. So really thinking about how much more difficult it is to learn when we're experiencing trauma. So trauma-aware responses. So I came up with a few examples of things that are likely happening in your courses right now. So the Zoom question, a student approaches you and is experiencing difficulty and continually can't either turn in assignments or continues to turn things in late and has expressed to you that things are challenging at home. And maybe they haven't even shared that with you, but you suspect maybe something is going on because they were turning things in and suddenly they're not, or they're not turning their video on when they used to be. Just observing some of those behaviors. A student shares that they just lost their job. A student gets the coronavirus or a family member does. So thinking about how can we respond to some of these scenarios through an inclusive or trauma-aware lens. I found this from another educator who does work around trauma-informed pedagogy, and I thought this was interesting because they took it from healthcare and medical practices, this idea of scope of practice. So I took it from there, and you can see this, I just included the slide down there, I just copied it. But some of those things of what are the lines there, especially protecting your own mental health and well-being as a faculty, because a lot of times I hear from faculty, where is that line of, I'm not a counselor, or I'm not this, I'm not that. So, and that's true. Most educators are not trained counselors. So thinking about, you have a situation such as the ones that I just gave examples of, do you have empathy? Of course. Do you start counseling? Likely not. You might provide some resources for the student to go in and seek out some support. Do you take an anti-racist approach, an inclusive approach? Yes, but do you ignore equity concerns that may be at play? Recognizing the probability of trauma in your classroom. So that's something, I have it on another slide as well, but kind of at this point in time, making the assumption that somebody is experiencing trauma in your classroom, particularly right now, not trying to assess individual trauma histories. Developing a self-awareness versus overly focused on behaviors of others. Curious about the impact of trauma on pedagogy versus rigidity or over-reliance on what worked for you as a learner. So I know a lot of times, particularly in disciplines that have a history and a culture of competitiveness, or other aspects of the pedagogies that really don't allow for flexibility or don't allow for you to maybe make some adjustments. For example, even showing student examples of good work. I've gotten pushback of that being you're spoon feeding the students. So maybe, kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking about, okay, is that really spoon feeding, or am I really doing everything I can to support my students in this particular time? Is that a boundary or a line that I feel good about, or a practice that I feel good about changing? So then, speaking about trigger warning, so I just mentioned an assumption of trauma. I believe Dr. Melton mentioned that too, an assumption that it's very likely that someone in your course has experienced gender-based violence, or at least in some capacity has some awareness. And so with these trigger warnings, I must bring up The Coddling of the American Mind. If you haven't read that, it's a very controversial and very talked about book right now. I did have to read it because I needed to know what they're talking about, because they're talking about me and what I do on campus for sure. But it's an interesting read. But they talk a lot about the culture of safetyism. So specifically about trigger warnings. While it is easy to see how this way of thinking, when brought to a college campus, could lead to requests for safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggression training, and bias response teams, it is difficult to see how this way of thinking could produce well-educated, bold, and open-minded college graduates. So the premise of the book is really that we are coddling students by having a bias reporting system, which is what our Office for Inclusive Excellence handles, by providing spaces where students feel they can communicate about something that's going on, perhaps in the classroom and perhaps with a faculty member. And certainly trigger warnings gets brought up a lot. And I was looking at a particular article that I thought was interesting that looked at how, well, I'll just read the quote first, but resistance within the academy toward understanding trauma as a pedagogical issue illustrates a failure to consider experiences of and responses to trauma as issues of disability and justice. So there's I included it in the resources there. It's an interesting article that looks at trauma, feminism, and disability sort of in an intersectional way. And I thought that was an interesting read that might help if you're interested more in trauma-informed pedagogy. But this debate around coddling versus empowerment is really fascinating to me. And it's if you Google, trigger warnings and coddling, I mean, it's all over this idea of we are not preparing our students. And I think it's very similar in terms of, students have experienced trauma. So one thing that Dr. Fukushima and I actually were talking about is, and I invite, other thoughts on this is, saying that there is particular content, there will be images of sexual assault, there will be, as, Dr. Salari, there will be a video that talks about very traumatic content. This is the content that you all are teaching. And then on top, so beyond just the warning, inviting students to take care of themselves, step out if you need to. In this case, maybe turn your video off if you need to stand up, or if you need to step out, or whatever that might be. But then you're also talking about, this is the big part of the debate is, do you allow students to just not complete an assignment because it's, and this is if you read The Coddling American Mind, that you're just allowing students to not take ownership of their learning. You're just making everything easy and everything comfortable. And so that's that big challenge of that. So thinking about what strategies you may or may not use for that. And then I have some resources for you. I think we're out of time here. So I'll go ahead and you can look at these at another time, but these are resources for you and your students.